I am not a religious man. That was my mistake. Growing up, my grandparents were my whole world. They were religious fanatics who believed in hellfire and brimstone. Every day, they preached the word of the Bible with a passion that bordered on madness. Sundays were sacred. Church was a ritual, a place where they surrendered their souls. They were good Christians, as they often reminded me, and I was supposed to be one too. As a child, I soaked up their teachings like a sponge. I wanted to be just like them, and I thought the Bible held all the answers. I spent countless hours reading scripture, my eyes wide and innocent, believing every word was gospel. My grandmother always said I'd grow up to be a priest, and for a long time, I believed her. I was her little disciple, a mirror of her devotion. But then everything changed. Middle school came, and with it, the kids from my neighborhood. They were different, looser, wilder. They did things kids that age do. Skateboarding, playing ball, cursing, watching things we shouldn't have. My mother worried I spent too much time with my grandparents and encouraged me to play outside, to be a normal kid. I adapted quickly, shedding my religious skin like a snake. Soon, I was dressing differently, talking differently, and doing things my grandparents would have condemned me for. By 16, I was experimenting with drugs, losing my virginity, living life on the edge. I was just a teenager having fun, but I knew I was straying far from the path my grandparents had laid out for me. I still visited them sometimes, but I never talked about what I was doing. The Bible, church, those things felt distant, irrelevant. I preferred my phone and video games, my cousins and friends. My grandmother noticed the change. She'd pull me aside and warn me not to push the Lord away, not to forsake the teachings. I'd brush her off, saying I was just having fun, but she became desperate, almost frantic. She begged me to stay consistent, to keep learning before it was too late. The look in her eyes was wild, unhinged, and I left that day feeling uneasy. Hell, my grandmother talked about it a lot. As a kid, I was terrified. She said that listening to earthly music or watching anything that didn't involve the Lord was a surefire ticket to damnation. So I lived in fear, trying to be perfect, turning off the television if anything non-Christian came on. I even scolded my mother for listening to secular music. But when I started hanging out with other kids, that fear melted away. By the time I felt truly free, I was rebelling against everything I'd been taught. I wrote anti-religion papers in high school, lashing out against the institution I felt had shackled me. I grew to resent my grandmother, her constant warnings about hell, her strictness. It all felt like a psychological prison. The older I got, the more anger festered inside me. I imagined all the kids who grew up fearing eternal damnation, just like I did. I decided to live for myself, not for some fictional deity. I became an agnostic atheist, skeptical of everything, even the existence of God. I figured there might be something out there, but I wasn't sure what. When I met my wife in grad school, she was studying mathematics while I pursued creative writing. Two sides of the spectrum, yet we clicked. She was stunning, almost otherworldly, and I couldn't believe someone like her lived in our small town. I approached her in the student center, and in a twist of fate, she needed a book I was returning. It felt like luck, and for the first time in years, I considered there might be something more. 5 months later, we found out she was pregnant. I didn't care that it was soon. I loved her and wanted to be the best husband and father. I proposed, and she said yes, but there was a catch. Her parents insisted on a religious ceremony. Despite my feelings, I agreed for her sake. Her happiness was worth more than my disdain for religion. Her parents were nice enough but reminded me too much of my grandparents. They spoke of God often and made me pray with them. It brought back all the old feelings of discomfort, but they weren't pushy about it. They just wanted me to feel included, which I respected. I spoke to my wife about how we'd raise our child, wanting to be on the same page. She was understanding and agreed to let our child decide about religion when they were older. I was relieved, content even. But everything changed in the last 2 months of her pregnancy. That's when the strangeness began. My wife started throwing up blood, dark, thick blood. I rushed her to the hospital, but the doctors found nothing wrong. They ran tests, checked everything, but she and the baby were healthy. I chalked it up to some weird symptom, but it didn't sit right with me. Then came the cravings. Pregnant women have strange cravings, but my wife's were unsettling. She craved blood. She wasn't drinking it like some vampire. She'd prick her finger with a thumbtack or give herself paper cuts and suck on the wounds. I noticed it a few times but said nothing, hoping it was just a phase. One night, I woke up to find her sitting up in bed, the lamp casting eerie shadows on the wall. She was repeatedly stabbing herself with a thumbtack, sucking on her thumb with an almost feral intensity. I grabbed her hand, demanding to know what was happening. She confessed that something about the taste of blood soothed her, stopped the pain from the baby kicking. She said it was the only thing that helped. I was horrified and insisted she see a therapist, hoping it would end the madness, but things only got worse. The day my son was born was the happiest day of my life, but that joy quickly turned into something else, something dark and cold. The doctors, the nurses, everyone who saw him commented on how different he was. The doctor who delivered him even said, "I feel like your son is going to change the world." At first, I thought he was just being polite, but the look in his eyes told a different story. My son was beautiful, unnaturally so. Even as a baby, he had a strange, magnetic quality that drew people to him. They'd stop us on the street, gushing about how adorable he was, how special, but I never felt comfortable. There was something off about him, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. He was too aware, too quiet. As he grew, the oddities only multiplied. He never laughed at cartoons or cried when he was alone. He just stared, as if lost in thought. My wife brushed it off, saying he was just introverted, like she had been as a child. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Then there was the Latin. By the time he was 9, he could understand it. Not speak it, not yet, but he knew what it meant. I discovered this when we visited a history museum. He stopped in front of a display of artifacts from the 7th century, his eyes locked on a piece of parchment with Latin scripture. He was reading it, not just looking, but reading. I asked if he knew what it said, and he nodded. I asked him to repeat it, but he shook his head, his eyes never leaving the text. My son was a genius, that much was clear. He excelled in school, picked up languages like they were nothing. He was popular too, always surrounded by friends. Even outside of school, people seemed drawn to him, like moths to a flame. My wife saw it as a blessing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was all wrong. One day, when he was 11, we were at a little league soccer game. My son was a star, naturally talented. But during the game, another kid slipped and twisted his ankle. The boy screamed, crying for help. My son ran over, kneeling beside him. The adults rushed over, but when they reached the boy, he stood up, saying he felt fine. His pain was gone, just like that. Everyone praised my son, calling him a good luck charm. The cheers and adoration echoed in my ears, and a chill ran down my spine. I remembered something my grandmother had told me all those years ago, a story about the Antichrist. She said one day a boy would be born who would grow up to be universally loved, performing miracles that would deceive the world. People would hail him as the second coming of Christ, but he would be the harbinger of the end, the beginning of the apocalypse. As I watched my son, smiling and waving at the crowd, I couldn't help but wonder, could he be what she prophesied, the Antichrist? And if he was, what did that make me? I tried talking to my wife about it, but she wouldn't listen. She believed our son was a miracle, that he was destined for something greater on this earth. When I told her she was starting to sound like a fanatic, she became defensive, insisting that he was special. Her voice wavered with emotion, her eyes wide with a fervor I hadn't seen before. I could feel the tension rising, a thick fog of unease settling over us. Not wanting to upset her further, I let it go. I shouldn't have. I could give you countless examples over the years of the strange things my son did. Always so joyful, always so eager to help others. There was an eerie perfection to everything he did, a calmness that felt unnatural for a child his age. But it wasn't until years later that I truly understood the horror of what I had brought into this world. A few weeks after his 22nd birthday, our carpet was worn and frayed, so we decided it was time to replace it. I asked my son to help me cut the old pieces, and he did it flawlessly, his hands working the blade with an eerie precision. I was so caught up watching him that I lost focus on what I was doing. My hand slipped, and I sliced my thumb open. Blood poured from the wound, thick and dark. I could see cartilage and bone, and the pain was blinding. My thumb throbbed with an intensity that made my vision blur. I knew I needed stitches. I was preparing to wrap my hand and rush to the hospital when my son walked over, calm as ever. He didn't hesitate, didn't flinch at the sight of my mangled thumb. Instead, he grabbed my hand with both of his grip firm yet strangely soothing. He looked me straight in the eyes, his gaze steady and unnaturally intense. For a moment, I was lost in his eyes, an abyss of calm that washed over me, dulling the pain and the panic. His voice was soft, almost hypnotic, as he said, "I'll never let anything bad happen to you. I'll always help you." He released my hand, and when I looked down, I felt a jolt of shock that nearly knocked me off my feet. My thumb, my mangled, bleeding thumb, was completely healed. Not a scratch, not a drop of blood. It was as if nothing had ever happened. I stared at him, my mind racing. He smiled at me, a serene, almost knowing smile, and went back to cutting the carpet as if nothing had happened, as if what I had just witnessed wasn't impossible, as if he hadn't just performed a miracle, or something much darker. That night, sleep eluded me entirely. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my thumb, whole and unblemished, where there should have been a deep, throbbing gash. The pain had vanished, but in its place, a gnawing unease had taken root, growing stronger with each passing hour. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the events of the day playing over and over in my mind like a broken record. My son's words echoed in my thoughts, chilling me to the core. The memory of my grandmother's voice kept intruding, unbidden, her dire warnings from years past surfacing with startling clarity. I hadn't thought about her in years, but now every word she'd ever spoken to me seemed to take on a new, terrifying significance. Was it possible that she had been right all along, that my rejection of her teachings had blinded me to the truth? The thought twisted in my gut like a knife. Driven by a rising sense of dread, I found myself leaving the bedroom and descending the stairs in the dark. The house was silent, save for the creaking of the floorboards beneath my feet and the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I moved as though in a trance, my destination clear in my mind: the library. The small room was lined with bookshelves, the dusty spines of countless volumes bathed in the pale light filtering through the window. I began searching, pulling books off the shelves with trembling hands, until I found what I was looking for, the old Bible I had owned since childhood. It was buried deep in a forgotten corner, stuffed into an ancient briefcase I hadn't opened in years. The leather cover was worn, the pages yellowed and brittle. It felt strange in my hands, almost foreign, like an artifact from a past life. I opened it, flipping through the pages with a desperation that surprised me. My fingers moved with a familiarity I hadn't known I still possessed, as though some part of me had never forgotten the lessons I'd once held so dear. I found the verse I was looking for, the one my grandmother had recited to me over and over. As I read the words, a cold shiver ran down my spine, a sense of foreboding settling over me like a heavy, suffocating blanket. And then that awful feeling, the sensation of being watched, of something unseen lurking just out of sight, descended on me with terrifying clarity. My skin prickled, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I turned slowly, dread clawing at my insides, and found my son standing in the doorway, his eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my breath catch in my throat. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice soft and curious, the innocence in his tone at odds with the sharpness in his gaze. I tried to smile, to steady my voice, but I could hear the tremor in it when I replied, "Just going through some old memories." He moved closer, his eyes never leaving mine, and took the Bible from my hands with a gentleness that was almost unsettling. "Why do you have this?" he asked, looking down at the book with a strange expression, as though it were an object of both fascination and disdain. "I wanted to remember something my grandma told me," I said, the words sounding hollow to my own ears. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he walked over to the ottoman in the corner of the room and sat down, the Bible still in his hands. For a long moment, he simply looked at it, his fingers tracing the edges of the worn cover. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost casual. "Nothing in this book is real," he said, his tone devoid of emotion. I felt a chill creep through me, a cold sweat breaking out across my skin. "What do you mean?" He looked up at me then, his eyes piercing, the innocence in them replaced by something far older, far darker. "It's fiction," he continued. "Just a collection of stories. But I can do more than this book ever promised. I can perform miracles, not just read about them." There was something in his gaze that sent a wave of fear crashing over me, a primal terror that I couldn't quite explain. "I've read this book," he said, his voice still unnervingly calm, "and it offends me. It feels like it's talking about me, but it's all wrong. I'm the one who can truly help people. I'm the one they should believe in." His words hung in the air, heavy and ominous. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but the words wouldn't come. All I could do was stand there, rooted to the spot, as he spoke with a conviction that was terrifying in its certainty. He stood up and walked toward me, his movements slow and deliberate. I could see the fear in my own reflection in his eyes, and I knew he saw it too. "Don't be afraid of me, Dad," he said softly. "I love you. It hurts me that you don't love me back." In that moment, guilt washed over me, drowning out the fear. I reached out, pulling him into a hug, my heart breaking as I whispered apologies into his hair. He returned the embrace, his arms wrapping around me with surprising strength. "It's okay," he murmured, "but you need to be ready for what's coming." "What do you mean?" I asked, pulling back to look at him. His smile was gentle, almost reassuring, but it did nothing to ease the growing terror in my chest. "People will learn the truth about me. They'll see that they don't need to believe in the Bible. I'm the proof they've been waiting for." As he turned and walked away, the room seemed to exhale, the oppressive weight lifting ever so slightly. I stood there, trembling, unable to move, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. It was only when I was sure he was gone that I finally allowed myself to breathe again. Slowly, I made my way back upstairs, the events of the night replaying in my mind like a horror film I couldn't turn off. My wife was still asleep, oblivious to the nightmare that had unfolded just downstairs. I knelt beside the bed, my hands clasped together so tightly that my knuckles turned white. And for the first time in nearly 30 years, I prayed. I prayed for strength, for understanding, for salvation from the darkness that had crept into our lives. But most of all, I prayed for my son, the boy who wasn't quite a boy, the child who carried within him something far more terrifying than I could ever comprehend. That night, I finally managed to get some sleep, though it didn't last long. I woke up suddenly, my body tense and unresponsive, as if I were being pinned down by some unseen force. Sleep paralysis, I thought, trying to rationalize the terror creeping over me. I had experienced it before, many times over the years. It was never pleasant, but this time felt different. I lay there, unable to move, every muscle in my body locked in place. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to call out for my wife, but no sound escaped my lips. I could only stare helplessly as my closet door creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness. Fear clawed its way into my mind, and I felt an icy chill wash over me. A shadowed figure emerged from the darkness of the closet, moving toward me with slow, deliberate steps. Every hair on my body stood on end, my skin prickling with dread. I wanted to scream, to flee, but I was powerless, trapped in my own body. In that moment, despite everything, I found myself wishing for my son to appear, to save me from whatever horror was coming my way. The figure sat down on the edge of the bed, right where my wife had been sleeping moments before. I could feel its weight pressing down beside me, but I couldn't see it clearly, only a vague, dark shape in the corner of my vision. The presence was suffocating, its malevolence palpable. "You're playing with fire," it said, its voice a low, rasping whisper that sent a shiver down my spine. "You shouldn't go back to something you rejected. Those who reject don't get to come back." I could feel its breath against my ear, cold and unnatural, as it continued. "You belong to me now, and so does he." With those final words, I was suddenly released from my paralysis. I bolted upright, gasping for air, my heart racing. I whipped around to find my wife still lying beside me, untouched, as if nothing had happened. The morning sun was just beginning to seep through the blinds, casting a warm glow across the room. I sat there trembling, trying to make sense of what I'd just experienced. Had it been a dream, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and fear? My wife stirred beside me, her eyes blinking open sleepily. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice thick with sleep. I hesitated for a moment before deciding to tell her everything, what had happened the night before and the horrifying dream I'd just had. As I spoke, the words tumbled out in a rush, my voice shaky with emotion. I told her that I believed our actions had damned us, that our son was a curse, a child of the devil himself. My wife listened in silence, her expression unreadable. When I finished, she simply got out of bed and walked toward the door. She paused in the doorway, looking back at me with a mixture of pity and anger. "You need to leave," she said quietly. "Get your head straight. Come back when you're ready to accept our son for the angel he is." I watched her walk away, my heart aching with a pain I couldn't put into words. Feeling lost and desperate, I decided to go to my grandmother's grave. She had passed away a few years ago, and though I'd been at her funeral, I hadn't felt much then. But now, kneeling at her grave, I felt a wave of guilt and regret wash over me. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice choked with tears. "I know you were trying to protect me. I didn't listen, and now I don't know what to do." I bowed my head, pressing my hands together in a prayer I hadn't said in decades. I begged for forgiveness, for some sign that I hadn't been forsaken, that God hadn't turned his back on me. I knew deep down that whatever that thing had said to me in my dream was a lie. I clung to the belief that God's love was infinite, that no one was beyond redemption. As I prayed, a sudden clarity washed over me, like a bolt of lightning striking my soul. I knew then why I had experienced all these things, why I had been shown what I had been shown. I had to warn others. I had to speak out against my son, to preach the word of the Lord and expose the truth about what he was. I knew what I had to do. With newfound resolve, I hurried back home, ready to confront whatever awaited me. But as I entered the house, my heart sank into my stomach. There, in the living room, was my wife, kneeling on the floor. Behind her stood our son, holding a steak knife in his hand. "What's going on?" I demanded, my voice barely more than a whisper. My wife turned to look at me, her eyes filled with a strange calm. "I'm tired of you speaking against our son," she said. "You've never accepted him since he was born. We're going to prove to you that he is the answer the world needs." My son's gaze met mine, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of something dark and unfathomable in his eyes. "You need to be ready for what's going to happen," he said, his voice eerily serene. Panic surged through me and I fell to my knees, begging him to stop, tears streaming down my face. "Please, don't do this," I pleaded. "I'll do anything you want, just stop." My wife looked at me with a mixture of pity and resolve. "This is the only way," she whispered. Without hesitation, my son reached forward and slit her throat. Blood sprayed across the room, splattering against the walls and floor. My wife gurgled, choking on her own blood, her body convulsing as she struggled for breath. I watched in horror as her life drained away, her eyes staring blankly ahead until they went still. I collapsed to the ground, my body shaking uncontrollably as sobs racked my chest. My son, still calm, walked over to my wife's lifeless body. He knelt beside her, placing his hands over the wound in her neck, and began to whisper something under his breath, words I couldn't understand. To my utter shock, my wife's eyes fluttered open. The wound on her neck was gone, her skin smooth and unbroken, as if nothing had happened. She sat up slowly, looking at me with a serene smile. "I told you," she said softly. "Please believe me." My mind reeled, unable to process what I had just witnessed. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be happening. But as I stared into my wife's eyes, I knew there was no denying the truth any longer. Whatever my son was, whatever power he possessed, it was beyond anything I could understand. And in that moment, I realized with chilling clarity that my nightmare had only just begun. I fled from my home, the terror of what I had witnessed pushing me to seek any kind of salvation. My legs carried me to the nearest church, driven by a frantic desperation to find help. Panting and disheveled, I burst through the heavy wooden doors and stumbled inside. The familiar scent of incense and old wood filled my senses, but it offered no comfort. I found a priest in the dimly lit sanctuary, his face etched with the calm assurance of his faith. I poured out my story, my voice trembling as I recounted the horrors I had seen, the miraculous healing, my wife's death and resurrection, and the chilling words of my son. I hoped desperately that this man of God would believe me, that he would understand the gravity of what I was saying. But as I spoke, I saw doubt and disbelief cloud his eyes. His response was a dismissive shake of the head, a firm but gentle assertion that such things could not be true. It was as if he were under some spell, hypnotized by my son's influence. The priest's denial cut deeper than any blade, leaving me feeling utterly abandoned. I left the church in a haze of despair, my faith in organized religion shattered. It became clear to me that no one would believe my warnings, no matter how fervently I tried to convince them. I realized that my son was far more than just a child with extraordinary abilities. He was a dark force, a harbinger of something far worse. I am writing this as a last attempt to reach out, to warn anyone who will listen. I know this message may sound like the ramblings of a desperate man, but I assure you, it is the truth. My son is the Antichrist, the beginning of the end. He will charm and deceive, drawing people away from the true word of the Lord. His charisma will ensnare many, leading them astray into the darkness he represents. Please heed my warning. Do not be swayed by his apparent miracles or the seemingly benign nature of his words. No matter how convincing he seems, do not give in to his seduction. The true Lord will guide and save those who remain steadfast in their faith. Arm yourself with the knowledge of the Bible and prepare for the trials to come. I do not know what will become of me or if I will ever escape this nightmare, but I know that if you follow my son, you will be lost to the same fate that awaits him. Repent, seek the truth, and hold fast to the teachings of God. The future is uncertain, but with faith, you may find a way to stand against the impending darkness. May the true Lord bless you all.